Welcome to Visionary, How William Blake Changed the World. This week we'll be discussing the links between William Blake and J.R.R. Tolkien, in particular their connections using British mythology. I'm joined this week by Sharon Choe, who's a research associate at the University of York, and her research areas span from disability studies to Norse reception in the 18th century. I'm also very pleased to welcome Will Sherwood, a PhD student at the University of Glasgow, examining the intersections of J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth legendarium and British Romanticism. He is also the Tolkien Society Education Secretary and is the co-editor with Dr. Julian Arman of the forthcoming book, The Romantic Spirit in the Works of J.R.R. Tolkien. Joining those two is also Annise Rogers, who's an ECR working on Blake's The Four Zoas and Poetical Forms, and has written on how Blake influenced the artists who in turn influenced Tolkien. How much Blake did Tolkien actually know? And if you wouldn't mind, Annise and Will, I know that both of you have been working on this in particular different areas. So Will, could you say a little bit about the connections between both Blake and Tolkien, but also perhaps Romanticism more generally?
How many hours do you have? Predominantly from what we've been able to find so far, there's two references to Blake in Tolkien's chronology biography. So the first one that appears is in a letter by his childhood friend, G.B. Smith, who was also a part of the TCBS, the Tea Club and Barovian Society, that had this kind of mission of using the arts as a way of morally cleansing Britain, the start of the 20th century. And for Tolkien, the key medium was poetry. So he wrote a lot of poetry and he'd send it off to his friends in the TCBS. And G.B. Smith back to him saying, it's a little bit difficult to work out exactly what you're saying. Like it's could be clearer, not so much enigmatic. And he recommends that Tolkien go away and read Blake's Songs of Innocence and other short lyrics. So specifically focusing on this idea of clarity within the poetry, not being dogmatic, just clear so the reader could actually understand what was going on. But thinking kind of like back to Rossetti's and Gilchrist's work on Blake and that kind of he is difficult to understand hitch. The second one comes later when I think Annise, you might be able to help me a little bit with this. I've just been trying to find the reference, but he reads a little bit of Blake's prophetic works. We don't know which one. He doesn't say. He's struck by the kind of mythological, like, oh yeah, Blake is trying to create a mythology for Britain as well. But because Tolkien was a philologist and he had such a focus on the linguistic elements of like nomenclature, for example, it's oh yeah, there's a character called Orc, but that's not my Orc. So he uses the Romantics as a way of kind of positioning himself against the established British literary canon. Although ironically kind of tying him into the literary canon in the process. So when he's kind of working in this reference with Blake's prophetic works, he's saying, I was horrified at what I read. It's not my type of thing. It was in a letter, and Tolkien's letters need to be taken with a pinch of salt. So like anyone's letters, he's writing to a specific audience, and very frequently when he's writing to the general public and fans, he uses his letters as a way of kind of crafting his own biography and his own literary interests. And I think to a degree, it's partially through the letters that we get the image of Tolkien just as a medievalist, a philologist, someone who's only interested in the North because of the well-quoted letter to Milton Waldman.
I think that's the first time I've ever been in a conversation where somebody's been recommended to read Blake for his clarity. Well, I just want to treasure that moment just for a second. But Annise, if you'd like to say a bit more about those connections, particularly the prophetic works, and also what we're going to talk about a little bit later in terms of Blake and art and Tolkien.
Yes, so I had to do some research looking into if there were any direct links and I did find what copy of Blake Tolkien had, which was in Tolkien's library and annotated checklist. And it was poetical works of William Blake, including the unpublished French Revolution, together with the minor prophetic books and selections from the Four Zoas, Milton and Jerusalem, edited by John Sampson from 1913. So we, as Will said, we know he read some of Blake's so-called prophetic works. We don't know what he read. We know that he read whatever it was he read in 1919, because he sent a letter out saying that he'd read it. So other than the earlier mentioned letter by Will, which actually came later chronologically, these are the only two real references. There is one very small reference to a quote from the preface to Milton, or Jerusalem the hymn, in one of his letters, but it is literally him just quoting in England's green and pleasant land in a kind of offhand British kind of way that everyone does. So yeah, finding direct links between them seems to have been not there weren't many. And then we have to also remember that he's probably going to be influenced later by the other Inklings. And we know that Lewis did not like Blake very much. He thought he was pretty ridiculous, didn't agree with his theology. And so you could probably say that Tolkien is going to be influenced in some way by that as well.
And actually just sticking with C.S. Lewis as a nice little diversion there, because C.S. Lewis writes directly in The Great Divorce as a rebuttal to Blake's Marriage of Heaven and Hell. As you say, Annise, he is very, very directly antagonistic. It's worth just sketching out a couple of comments that you make there. With regard to that quotation from what will become known as Jerusalem, it is, of course, during this period following the First World War that poem from the preface to Milton and Did Those Feet in Ancient Time becomes known as Jerusalem, because of course it's set to music by Parry, and becomes incredibly well known. So that there is this fillip, this little outburst in England, to be honest, not in Britain, in England, in terms of a greater recognition of Blake, because Jerusalem is a kind of an overnight success, the hymn, Parry's setting to music, and it becomes very well known. But even around that time, I mean, the turn of the 20th century, so a lot of the stuff I've been looking at from the reception of Blake, what you find is that during the period when Gilchrist was writing and the pre-Raphaelites at the latter part of the 19th century, there's this huge interest in rediscovering Blake. Then he goes out of fashion, actually. So actually around about literally the turn of the century, Blake is starting to be seen as a bit old-fashioned. He's liked by that older generation of Victorian artists. And then he's rediscovered. There's two things that go on that I've mentioned already with Jerusalem, but also actually Blake then, during the late 1910s and early 1920s, is ironically rediscovered by the modernists. There's this completely new Blake, which also then seems very antithetical to a lot of what Tolkien wants to do with his work. But a general point is that Blake in that second decade of the 20th century really does start to come back into fashion. He's read a lot more. And that text you mentioned, the John Sampson edited version, prior to Geoffrey Keynes's complete works in 1927, that is the authoritative version of Blake's poetry, which also means that Tolkien was fairly up to date with the scholarship of his day with regard to what Blake was actually publishing.
That actually seems very Tolkien-like, to be in the know about what is the most prevalent and most important scholarship. So for Keats, for example, it was Sidney Colvin's 1882, 1883 biography, Keats, that Tolkien then read in preparation for his exams at Oxford in 1915. So it does feel that when we're thinking about Tolkien's reception and reading of the Romantics and thinking of himself or seeing him in a romanticist way, it seems like he is aware and perhaps engaging with romanticist scholarship of a high quality.
There's an irony to us that we're often looking back to Tolkien of this period of, several decades since his death. So stuff that now seems old-fashioned was very much the cutting edge, or, the avant-garde of actual scholarship in different areas. And in terms of academia, Blake was not that well studied in the first couple of decades of the 20th century. The real scholarship would start following from the 1920s and even the 1940s with Northrop Frye. So Tolkien makes best use of what's available to him, I suspect. Sharon, if you wouldn't mind, if I could just bring you to say a little bit about Blake's myth building. And in particular, I'm thinking ahead to some of the comments we're going to be talking about later around kind of British mythology and British background. But, just how Blake literally constructs these strange worlds of his.
We talk a lot about the syncretic practice of Blake, which is where he kind of takes from multiple cultures and just kind of smashes it all together. And that's kind of how he creates a foundation to then build up, build off. And he takes all these sometimes contradictory symbolisms and meanings and will just layer them on top of each other, which is why Blake can come across as very dense and also makes it really interesting because, for me, I come at it from an Old Norse perspective, and I will see things that someone like Annise, who's coming at it from the biblical traditions, might not see. I won't see her perspective either, but it doesn't mean that they're wrong interpretations. They're working together. And I think that's a really interesting aspect and also very frustrating aspect of Blake's kind of myth building. But I think it's also interesting to think about how to approach Blake's worlds, because I think quite famously Blake, he was pretty much against system building. A lot of the narratives and the poetry is kind of thinking about breaking free from these oppressive structures. And yet a lot of the way that we are maybe able to approach it is by thinking of it as a system, even if it's not actually that coherent, possibly, in comparison to Tolkien, which is a little bit more coherent.
So yeah, as Sharon was saying, I come to Blake through a sort of like more biblical perspective, which actually is very useful for when you're thinking about Tolkien's perspective as well, because people tend to not forget, but almost put aside these kind of your religious viewpoint as if it doesn't affect how you build a world. And for Blake and for Tolkien, I think the Bible is exceptionally important. They use it in exceptionally different ways, but they also are very happy to use other things. So the Norse myths, Tolkien uses the Finnish myths, and obviously he uses Beowulf and the Anglo-Saxon, which Blake didn't have access to because they had lost how to translate it. They incorporate everything that interests them together, everything that they see as connected in some way, almost creation, if you like. This idea of they take the different creation myths or the different ways things are created and place them together to create a new kind of creation. That's probably the best way of connecting them. They both take as much knowledge and as much myth and as much art as they can, and they try to redefine it and make it into something new.
Will, I'd like to bring you in to talk very specifically about Tolkien's world building, but I just want to quickly make a comment which hasn't really struck me quite so strongly as until now. But of course, in the 1920s, T.S. Eliot in The Sacred Wood, he makes this really quite pertinent comment, I think, about Blake, which is that Blake as a lyric poet is, T.S. Eliot has a huge amount of time for Blake as a lyric poet. But he then is very critical of Blake's myth building, of his world building, for the simple reason that for Eliot, it's an abandonment of the great tradition. It's an abandonment of, the classical and Judeo-Christian values which have propelled Western civilization. I mean, Lisa, clearly from the comments she was making, is that's wrong with regard to both Blake and Tolkien. But it also strikes me that one of the things that at the beginning of the 21st century, looking back, is that the creation of a new mythology in terms of Middle-earth has, if nothing else, become one of the best-selling worldviews. It's almost that it's become its own great tradition in the late 20th and early 21st century. So if you could tell us a little bit more about how Tolkien went about this process of myth building and world building.
Yeah, certainly. It's again whole books have been written about this. If anyone is interested while listening to this, I would highly recommend Verlin The Invention of Myth, which really digs into this, and also probably one of the greatest works of early Tolkien scholarship, Verlin Splintered Light, as well. Both excellent reads. I just wanted to, just before I do, kind of tap into what's just been discussed, and this idea that syncretic approach of building on so many different traditions, and so you have this sense of density. Tolkien very much worked in a similar way from a very early period, and one of his oft quoted and referenced works is his lecture on fairy stories, where he gives this analogy of the soup, where I'm quoting now saying, quote, "By the soup, I mean the story as it is served up by its author or teller, and by the bones, its sources and material, even when, by rare luck, those can be with certainty discovered." So Tolkien's kind of playing a little bit with the audience, and there's a little bit of tongue in cheek in there. But he's thinking about his own process, I think, within the 1930s. He'd already published The Hobbit. He had already started to work on The Lord of the Rings by the time he delivered the lecture in 1939. But if we go all the way back to when it started, oh, well, this happens in the 1910s when he's still in that kind of Oxford sphere. He's still connected to the TCBS with that romantic national drive to cleanse and recreate England in a way that they sort of fit. And so they've got this kind of focus on England rather than Britain that, Jason, as you were saying, with Jerusalem springing up overnight, Tolkien most certainly would have known it, and he loved music. He kind of suggests maybe he might have been tone deaf, like he wasn't a good musician, but he loved music. And so in the 1910s, he was reading a lot of Nordic sources. Which he came to through like William Morris's translation and publication of the Volsunga saga, which was, Morris kind of considered it the northern equivalent to Homer's duology. Like, if the Mediterranean has Homer, we have Volsunga saga. Morris thought it was so important. But you've also got his translation of Beowulf. So Tolkien is absorbing these late medieval renditions of Nordic texts in his childhood before he was even a student at Oxford. But when he gets to Oxford, like we've kind of been talking about, that scholastic level, that layer membrane starts to take over. And so he's thinking about it in a more critical manner. And we get, like Sharon, you were talking about how you find references in Blake that Annise may not pick up on, and Annise picks up references that you don't. And I was talking to a PhD student down at Oxford recently who is literally looking at Nordic resonances in Tolkien's work from the 1910s and 1920s. And she picks up on so many motifs that general Tolkien scholarship hasn't identified, and I can't wait to read it. But he's, again, layering in that kind of syncretic method from Blake certainly could be applied to Tolkien. You've got the Nordic in there, Germanic. He started reading classics. When he went to Oxford, he had to translate classics when he was at King Edward's School in Birmingham. He was very familiar with Greek and Roman, so that kind of the Hellenic classical education that we kind of associate with like Byron and Shelley, for example. Tolkien was a part of that kind of educational tradition, so he knew all of this. And there's a very good book edited by Hamish Williams on Tolkien and the classical world that I would recommend anyone who's interested in that connection go and have a look at. So you've got all of these world mythologies and traditions that Tolkien is building into his mythology to England, as he famously phrases it in the Milton Waldman letter many years later. But there's also resonances of various Celtic folklore, fairy tales, in that he was fascinated and in love with everything Welsh. He loved Welsh so much. He says that he wasn't necessarily as fond of the Irish, but he never actually mastered the language. In the drafts on fairy stories, he also acknowledges the relevance of Scotland and Scottish folklore and fairy tale. So Andrew Lang, who was quite a significant folkloric and fairy tale figure for Tolkien, was Scottish. There's also the connections through to Robert Kirk's Secret Commonwealth. That there's so many ties to Tolkien. So he isn't really dealing just with the North like some people do. And unfortunately, we do get the right, the fascist, the neo-Nazi kind of appropriations of Tolkien now, well, from as early as the publication of Lord of the Rings, really hammering home that kind of Nordic and Northern heritage side of it, when in reality, I think we could really build in like Tolkien scholars could build on and incorporate Blakean scholarship with this idea of syncretic myth building, because there's so much going on. There's been studies about connections to Buddhists, faith and religion, the idea of resurrection, for example. There are certain characters, Glorfindel is resurrected, Gandalf's resurrected, even that on a granular level or a grand epic level, there are so many connections to different mythologies and traditions all over the world.
I'd like to actually come in there with there's a quotation in terms of this syncretic tradition. It's from Jerusalem, The Emanation of the Giant Albion, which was Blake's immense 100-page epic, beautifully illustrated, every plate. And in its loss says, "What do I see? The Briton, Saxon, Norman, Roman, amalgamating in my furnaces into one nation, the English, and taking refuge in the loins of Albion. The Canaanites united with the fugitive Hebrew, whom she divided into 12 and sold into Egypt, then scattered the Egyptian and Hebrew to the four winds. This sinful nation created in our furnaces and looms is Albion." So, I mean, right there, you have this sense for Blake in which he's very, very plugged into a kind of an antiquarian tradition, which is of these movements of peoples through history, etc. And that what you end up with the kind of the Atlantic archipelago is this real melting pot of different cultures. I mean, bizarrely, the Hebrews or their precursors actually came to Britain. There's a wonderful story from an antiquarian called Edward Davis, in which he argues that when we're told about Noah's Ark landing on Mount Sinai, it was actually Penmanmawr. And Noah founded the Druids in North Wales because that's where the Ark came down and happened to land. And this was kind of stuff that Blake was very tuned into at the time. Complete nonsense, but part of a real surge during the early imperial era for Britain to kind of start creating its own myths. And it's some of that I'd like to explore now. You've mentioned already the letter in which Tolkien says that he wants to create an English mythology. And Blake, of course, Blake himself seems to have a fairly tense relationship to the notion of England and Englishness. I mean, the hymn for which he's most well known, what becomes known as Jerusalem, is actually written, of course, after he is arrested for sedition, for saying "damn the king" and opposing the British establishment. But at the same time, Blake is obsessed with, how do we create a better country? How do we create a better nation? I mean, we seem to have 3 or 4 separate elements here. You've already referenced the Celtic, the Welsh mythologies. We've got the Northern antiquities. I'll bundle together, which is heinous to do, but the Germanic and the Scandinavian elements that take place. And of course, we also actually have these biblical traditions. Ironically, for Blake, in his poetry at least, the one thing that doesn't come through very strongly is a Hellenic and classical civilization, although in his art, he was very much a neoclassical artist. I'd like to bring in Sharon, first of all, to talk a little bit about the Northern antiquities, the Norse use of mythology, because that's one that we've been touching upon several times already in this talk.
Yeah. I mean, I think in the 18th century, what's really interesting is that people, like you said, they like in England, Scotland, Britain, just on the islands, they were all kind of trying to figure out what is Britishness, Englishness, it's the period of the Acts of Unions, everything was kind of coming together, but also really not coming together. So there's a lot of tension there, and also thinking about heritage and culture. And Scandinavia and the North and the Norse stuff just kind of became subsumed into it, and it became part of those conversations where people were trying to figure out the distinct cultural lines. And so Thomas Percy's Northern Antiquities, I think there's just this really interesting flowchart. I'm calling it a flowchart. I don't know if it is, but there's like a chart thing where he's distinguishing Gothic and Celtic through linguistic roots. And I don't know where he got this from, or if he made it up himself. But it's really interesting how he's separating Old Saxon from like Old Icelandic to the Gaulish to the Welsh to the Scot. He's just kind of separating it all and trying to basically kind of show the differences as well as the similarities. And obviously Percy famously kind of wrote his poetry in response to James Macpherson and the Ossian poems. So, he obviously has a bit of an agenda in trying to separate the English from the Scottish. But the Norse aspects were a key part of that discussion, and a key part of how these different British nations were approaching their own culture and heritage and trying to kind of figure out, who are we?
One of the things that when I first started reading and researching into William Blake was this also then coincided with a period in the 18th century of the emergence of what will become Welsh nationalism, a reinvigorated sense of Welsh identity. From the 18th century, there then comes a strong sense of Wales as a lost nation, the country of Wales that was subsumed by England. I really love that notion that Blake is operating at this juncture whereby Britain is literally coming into existence as a political entity. And at the same time, there's this sense of the four in one, the four distinct nations, all these nations potentially together, but also at war, which of course leads into Blake's famous notion of the four Zoas. I was wondering, Will, if you could make some comparisons with the kind of the notions of identity, national identity and self-identity that are taking place with Tolkien's world, Tolkien's milieu at the turn of the 20th century, at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century.
Yeah, it's really interesting to just listening back to what both of you've just been suggesting, like that idea of Percy was trying to delineate between the Gothic and the Celtic. He came to the Gothic language very early on, and then he worked with Joseph Wright, who he had literally read the primer of. So he wrote poetry in the Gothic language. He tried to continue the literary and linguistic tradition. He mentions in the appendices of The Lord of the Rings, and Christopher Tolkien had kind of built on this a little bit with the Unfinished Tales, that the ancestors of the Rohirrim, the names are based on Gothic kings. So Tolkien, strangely enough, he blamed the Roman Empire for the fall of the Goths in a strange kind of reversal. He was like, it's because of this decline that the Gothic culture declined, and so he has this affinity and tie with the Goths, and that sense of loss that inevitably happened, and the fact that he has to kind of do a pseudo Gothic language that he called Gortisk to create poetry. So it's interesting, this kind of how the two really have very powerful ties, but then connects him through Percy. And the antiquarian stuff is so important for Tolkien, as myself, Nick Groom, and Dimitra Feeney have all argued. I found evidence in his undergraduate notebooks that he learned about Macpherson and the obvious Ossian controversy. And then there's so many parallels between the Ossian works and Tolkien as well. But that in itself was, I think, a 30-page article, so I won't go into it. Regarding this idea of identity, the or English identity specifically, Tolkien's first major work. So if he published The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings in his lifetime, that was so far after he'd started to write the Book of Lost Tales, which we know nowadays as the Silmarillion, the kind of like the mythological Bible, in quotation marks, to Middle-earth. And he originally created it as a frame narrative that was much like Macpherson and Ossian, wrapped up in the oral tradition. How do you transmit history? That was kind of like the key question that was, and myth at the heart of the work. But the framers, the first chap was called Eriol, original name Otto, who was supposed to be the father of Hengist and Horsa, the founders of England, the Anglo-Saxons. And I can't remember where, it's kind of at the moment in the jumble of 10,000 books and things that I've been reading for the PhD, but Tolkien came across, or he heard a lecture from a chap who said the Anglo-Saxons are not the fathers, they're not the heritage of England. And Tolkien was he was not happy at all. He was furious at this, and so he's like, right, okay, my turn now. And so yeah, the Anglo-Saxons for him really were the like pinnacle of English heritage. In kind of a way connects him to Chatterton, the way that Chatterton as well is thinking about the Battle of Hastings, and then obviously he's written his the two versions of the Battle of Hastings as a tragedy, the Fall of Harold and the Harold, I should say, and Britain. So even if he necessarily wasn't aware of that, there's this affiliation between Chatterton and Tolkien, and the idea of the Anglo-Saxons as the ancestors of England connected through to the Goths and the Germanic peoples in general is very much where Tolkien believed that to come through. And it's very clear in his letters and his other works that this was a very strong, powerful motivator for him. Like I was saying, that famous letter where he talks about he wanted to dedicate Book of Lost Tales to England. At least his idea of England, we should always frame it.
Building off what I said about Percy and kind of the linguistic roots thing, because like a big part of the 18th century Northern antiquarian stuff was thinking about the roots of nationhood through language. And so the terms like Celtic and Gothic were interchangeably used. Like they didn't really know the difference. They couldn't quite differentiate it. And so, and there's like I found a quote in my thesis because I couldn't remember it. And I was like, oh, this might be quite interesting. But there was a review of Beowulf in the monthly magazine where they compare the language of like England, Denmark, Norway, and Iceland, that they're all the same in how they use their poetry. And so they make this like comparison with the Nordic countries. And so I'm just kind of wondering with Tolkien, was he all like, I mean, because obviously he's very into his languages and like linguistics, was that still a very, very strong way of how he was connecting it back to England, or was it kind of being fleshed out and developed with lots of other stuff?
Linguistically, certainly, he very much bases it on kind of like northern languages. Welsh, like I said, was such a strong influence on the Elvish languages, for example, and he rooted it fundamentally in England. Like you've just said about the 18th century kind of uncertainty. By the time we get to the early 20th century, the mist has cleared. There's a real sense of, at least for Tolkien, there's a real sense of clarity between the Celtic nations, the Gothic, the Germanic nations. And so, yeah, in his head, he can split it, but his work becomes an amalgamation of so many sources. And there is a letter where he says that he doesn't like the word Nordic, which could be dug into quite far, but he was certainly familiar with, like, the Icelandic sagas. For example, he does talk about them. So I think when it comes to the Nordics and the Nordic influence on him, he's perhaps just a little bit more sensitive than, like you were saying, in the 18th century about specific roots and how that ties in.
I want to bring Annise in a moment to talk a little bit about particularly those influences of Macpherson on epic forms. I do have, as you're speaking, I just want to share what, for me, a fantastic illustration of the differences of understanding of philology in the 18th century versus the late 19th and early 20th century, when Tolkien was working as a scholar of languages. In the late 18th century, you could get writers like Edward Davis claiming, Welsh, well, it doesn't really sound like Germanic. It doesn't sound like English. It doesn't sound like Italian. Oh, I know what it is. It's Hebrew. Welsh is basically the same as Hebrew. And even prior to that, in the 17th century, a writer called Aylett Sams, who does this wonderful, fantastically made up history of a mythology of Britain, in which the Phoenicians populate the British Isles, use it as a trading post. And in fact, for Aylett Sams, the name of Britain comes from this entirely spurious made-up word from Phoenician called Barat Anak, meaning a field of tin. So, in the 17th and 18th century, scholars were really happy to just make stuff up and then claim that this was the historical antecedent of various linguistic activities. I mean, Sharon, you mentioned that that they don't really distinguish between Gothic and Celtic and stuff like that. Basically, when they get outside of Greek, Latin, and even in some cases English isn't entirely safe, they don't really have an understanding of where any of these languages come from. They understand the Romance languages as descended from Italian and Latin, obviously. They're very good at Greek, but outside and some scholars are good at Hebrew. But outside of that, it's a real mishmash in the 18th century of where actually linguistics comes from. And actually, there is a connection to this, because I think of the biblical and Hebrew connections, and particularly through the style of Ossian and Macpherson's writing. So for listeners who may not know, Macpherson claimed to have translated a lost epic from, I think it was the 4th century AD, sort of Irish and Scottish poetry, which became phenomenal across Europe. I mean, it was one of the best-selling works of the time. Even Napoleon, I think is his brother, named one of their children after a character in Ossian. It was incredibly well known, well liked. And then, of course, when it transpired that Macpherson had made this up, that he'd invented the manuscripts, this completely caused a collapse in its fame. But Annise, if I could invite you and say a little bit, particularly about this as a formation of epic writing.
Yeah, so Will mentioned Rowley as well, who was made up by Chatterton and pretended to have found these poems and was producing these. I found these poems, here they are, and had the same kind of controversy. Obviously, not quite as large because Chatterton died at 19, but Macpherson really wanted to try and create this kind of epic feel, but he wanted to move beyond what we would probably consider like the classics of Homer, Virgil, and this kind of poetical style. One of the big things with epic is that one of its key definitions is that it must be written in verse, which is of course wrong. It can be written in prose. So Macpherson's poetry, especially his epics, actually his Ossian epics, that they're more prose-like. They look prose. You read them as prose. They actually read very much like the marriage of heaven and hell at some points, and this kind of poetic language. But this idea of this poetical prose, this kind of moving backwards, he pulled on language ideas of a time, that of a place. He used particular phrases built on what was known and used like a factual base to create this mythology, which was completely false. But what I find most interesting about it is the fact that Blake found out that Chatterton and Macpherson made these myths up, made these epics up, and was like, I don't care. I think great poetry is great poetry, and it doesn't matter that they're fake. They're still fantastic. And this kind of, he says something along the lines of, I'd rather read them than a lot of other things. I'd rather read this fake epic, which works with all the ideas of what epic should be. It works with the history and the poetry and this idea of what epic might be. I'd rather read that than these terrible 18th century epics, of which there were thousands, of these like nationalistic kind of God is on our side, and devil is on the French's side, and we don't want, we want to be, yes, we want to be a military power, and he moves away from that and kind of is like, actually, Ossian's really good. I much prefer this kind of engagement with the style and the themes rather than with the form of epic.
Which brings us back again to this idea of myth building, of world building. What Macpherson is literally doing is creating, we use the word fake, but it's actually this fictional, this created world of Celtic culture from, actually synonymous, coterminous with the Roman Empire, but completely untouched by it, which of course was part of the appeal for certain types of nationalist thinking in the early 19th century. That there was an original genius in Britain which hadn't been infected by classical sources, etc. But of course, I suppose what I'm trying to get at here is that Blake's myth building, his world building, doesn't come out of nowhere. There are precursors which are very much involved. In fact, with Macpherson, an incredibly popular precursor. So Blake grows up essentially reading this fiction, this historical fiction, passing itself off as a natural epic of the British Isles, which when Blake finds out, he goes, you know what? I want to do that. I don't care. As you say, I don't care that it's made up. That's the whole point. It's an exercise in imagination. And that's always struck me. I think a lot of people who are interested in both Blake and Tolkien, one of the things that brings them together is this fascination with creating worlds. I was wondering if we could say a little bit in terms of that a widespread public imagination. Tolkien seems a brilliant example of that.
Yeah, there's a book by Brian Roseberry literally called The Tolkien Phenomenon, and Nick Groom in his recent 21st Century Tolkien kind of elaborates on this concept of Tolkien as a phenomenon. The exercise of biography is in itself fictionalized or biased to some degree. The phenomenon of Tolkien is always seen through subjective lens. Whoever is coming to it, like I kind of hinted at earlier, the far right appropriations of Tolkien that have happened in the past, and we have, for example, the heated debates that have been going on recently around the Rings of Power discussions surrounding race and ethnicity within Tolkien is quite a hotly debated topic. But because certain people prefer to read into what they believe to be the authorial truth, so what was Tolkien's vision, and that is the only way you can read Tolkien, is how Tolkien wanted to be read. But as I kind of referenced earlier, Tolkien wanted to be seen in a particular way. Like he always referred to Ossian as phony, even to the 1960s. So he would try and put distance between himself and Keats, but he was constantly dealing with Keats. There was constant negotiations with Keats through to his work in the 1960s. It's difficult to really kind of grapple and say, I know who Tolkien is, because there's so many variations, much like, with the amount of biographies there have been of Blake, each one sees him slightly differently. And Verlin Flieger in the Arch and the Keystone talks about this concept that we all have our own Tolkien. And I think, to be honest, it's something we could just extrapolate and apply to anything in history. Like, we all have our own personal way of reading something. And so someone may prefer to read Tolkien through a Catholic lens. And there are Tolkien fans who fundamentally say that you can't understand Tolkien unless you are Catholic. There are certain, like, I'm an atheist, for example, but I don't see that at all. I love learning about how other religious traditions and faiths have parallels with Tolkien, and I find that exciting, and it enriches my understanding of Tolkien. There are people who are only interested in the languages as an exercise, like Annise was saying about the idea of myth building for your nation as an exercise. Tolkien's languages kind of seen in the same way. You've got editors who only work on his languages. You've got people who only want to focus on Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit because that's the only things that he published. Other people love to go to the Book of Lost Tales because it's his national work. You've got figures who use critical theory to read Tolkien. It's a kaleidoscopic fan base. There are so many different ways of reading Tolkien. You have fan fiction, which has been as quite a history actually. But in the Tolkien and Diversity seminar, Dawn Wolves Thuma did an excellent paper on looking at fan fiction engagements with Tolkien and how, from what I recall from Dawn's paper, it predominantly female authors who were engaging with that element of Tolkien's legacy. And I suppose that's a word we need to consider, legacy. Like how are we creating that legacy and that phenomenon around Tolkien, like the Italian exhibition at the moment, like how is that portraying Tolkien? What is the title of the exhibition? The Bodleians, Maker of Middle-earth. Well, by only talking about Middle-earth, we forget about the fact that Tolkien wrote a lot of fiction that wasn't first and foremost connected to his mythology. He's got children's stories, he's got poems, he's got essays. He's, so many people try and drag his essays on Beowulf and on fairy stories to read Lord of the Rings and his mythology. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Everyone has their own way of reading it, and that's fine. But kind of by allowing the mythology to consume Tolkien, it kind of sometimes can present him as a little bit one-dimensional because there's so many further elements, so many other works. It's a really complicated question to answer, but I think that kind of the metaphor of the kaleidoscope really summarizes not only who Tolkien was, what his works achieved, how they continuously changed and adapted across the 60 years he was rewriting and remediating his mythology, but the ways that we now think about it and talk about Tolkien and his works.
Thank you. I think that question in terms of legacy, that's a great point to end off, actually. And I'll invite both Sharon and Annise to talk a little bit of kind of the legacy of William Blake, or indeed Annise, because I know you've done work on both, the legacy of both Blake and Tolkien. So Sharon, first, if I can ask you Blake's legacy, if you had to summarize it, how do you think you would go about that?
That's such a hard question. Well, I mean, I think from my perspective, I guess from my approach and like how I come at Blake, I think his legacy is just one of all the different cultures and stories that he's kind of drawing together and piecing together in this brand new puzzle, because I think it opens up all of these different cultures and approaches that even if you're coming at it from one very specific angle, you're able to then find another section that you're interested in, and he's just a great way of learning, I think, about how worlds work, cultures work, people and their thoughts work, their imagination. I think that's just part of his legacy, and just as a very frustrating riddle, but also a very interesting riddle for everyone to kind of solve, or maybe never solve.
Thank you. And Annise, if you'd like to a final comment on both Blake and Tolkien.
Yeah, on Blake, the brilliant late Maurice Eves wrote a fantastic article called "On Blakes We Want and Blakes We Don't," which deals with this idea of we look at Blake and we see the Blake we want to see. And the more I've read of Blake and the legacy is, people try to see Blake as Blake the poet or Blake the artist, or Blake the myth builder, and Blake is definitely in scholarship, usually seen as very serious. Blake is really funny. He writes some great satirical pieces. He makes digs at people he doesn't like. He can be outright rude. He is a person that I think is been defined by certain aspects of what he has done, and I think that quite recently that started to open up again. People are starting to see him as more than just Blake the poet or Blake the artist or Blake the reformist. It's sort of like a whole rounded view. And I think when I with Tolkien, I'd read lots of his fictional mythological stuff as well as his other works, and when I looked at his art, I realized that there was a kind of depth. There was this person beyond the words, and I think people tend to, especially if all you read is the fictional works, you tend to see Tolkien the writer of fictional stories, or Tolkien the scholar, and there's not. It's Tolkien the artist, Tolkien the letter writer, Tolkien the father and the husband, Tolkien the person. And I think that a lot of people are so strict in that this is the way to view Blake, or this is the way to view Tolkien, that they forget as people they change their minds. Blake does it all the time. He's forever changing his minds, developing characters. I mean, Will talked about the idea that Tolkien was like, oh, it's the Romans' fault that the Goths were destroyed. I mean, it's Blake who says the classics and not the Goths nor the monks that desolate Europe with wars. But early he was like, Homer's the best, and within about 4 years he's like, I hate Homer. So he has this ongoing view, and I think with Tolkien, especially from his earlier scholarship, I think is probably the best way to look at it. His views develop and change too, and I think people tend to see the legacy of people as static. And we need to stop doing that. We need to start seeing them as people who have lives and are rounded and can be wrong or change their minds.
We need to start seeing them as people. I think that's a wonderful note to end our topic conversation on. You've been listening to Visionary, How William Blake Changed the World, and we've been talking about the myth building and world building of William Blake and J.R.R. Tolkien. I'd very much again like to thank my guests for joining me today. So these are Sharon Choe, Will Sherwood, and Annise Rogers. We'll be returning, I'm sure, to Blake, Tolkien, and mysticism in a future discussion. And I'm Jason Whittaker at the University of Lincoln. Thank you, and tune into our next podcast, which will be coming soon.